frozen world of Glacis 6 stretched out like an endless sea of cracked ice and jagged cliffs, shimmering under the pale light of a dying star. The air was so cold it seemed to burn the lungs with every breath. As the transport shuttle roared away into the clouds, the alien students stood huddled together, already layering their survival cloaks and flexing their outer membranes to adjust to the conditions. In their midst stood Maya Torres, the only human cadet enrolled in the Galactic Academy's Extreme Survival Program. She tightened the scarf around her face, feeling the cold gnaw at the edges of her body, despite the layers she had managed to bring. No technology, no artificial heating, and no outside help. That was the rule, and for the next 8 planetary days, they would have to survive on wit and instinct alone. The alien professor, an imposing Glothrin named Professor Trithar, floated down from the shuttle in his grav chair, his massive blue form encased in an adaptive biosuit that regulated his internal temperature. He observed the shivering students with the detached interest of a biologist watching specimens in a lab. His translucent eyes swept over the group before settling on Maya for a moment longer than the others. A hint of amusement flickered across his face, though he said nothing. "Begin," he declared, his voice reverberating in the still, frigid air. The students scattered quickly, each heading toward different sections of the frozen wasteland. Some began digging into the snow, forming shallow pits to conserve heat. Others searched for natural caves or hollowed ice pockets that might offer shelter. Maya, however, stood still for a long moment, surveying the landscape with narrowed eyes. She knew she would not survive by simply mimicking what others were doing. Her biology was vastly different. While many alien species could lower their metabolic rates or even enter partial hibernation, she had no such advantage. If she stopped moving, if she let herself grow too cold, she would be dead within hours. She took a cautious step forward, her boots crunching against the brittle ice. The temperature, according to her wrist monitor, was already plummeting below -80 degrees Celsius. She needed a plan, and she needed it fast. Maya decided to head toward a series of jagged cliffs rising in the distance. If there were any natural shelters to be found, they would likely be there. As she trudged forward, the wind picked up, howling through the canyons like a living thing. Ice crystals stung her exposed skin, and her breath crystallized instantly in front of her face. Her legs felt heavy, her joints stiff. Every instinct screamed at her to stop, to curl up and conserve energy like the others. But she knew better. Stopping now would only accelerate her death. After an hour of exhausting struggle, she reached the cliffs. There, nestled in the shadow of a massive overhang, she found her first sign of life, a trail of peculiar footprints leading into a shallow cave. The prints were wide and flat, almost like those of a bear but with elongated toes. Curiosity outweighed caution. She followed them inside. The cave was dimly lit by faint bioluminescent moss clinging to the walls. The temperature inside was marginally better, though still brutally cold. Huddled together at the far end were half a dozen creatures, large, lumbering beings covered in thick, shaggy fur that glistened with frost. They resembled a cross between a yak and a sloth, with slow, deliberate movements and deep, resonant breaths that filled the cave with soft echoes. Maya crouched low, observing them from a safe distance. She recognized the species from her briefing files, Urolons, native to Glacis 6, known for their docile nature and incredible resistance to cold. She watched as one of the Urolons shifted, and clumps of its fur drifted to the ground like dandelion seeds. She stared, realization dawning on her. The Urolons shed their fur naturally, creating thick bedding for insulation. They didn't need to dig elaborate shelters because they carried their warmth with them and shared it freely among their herd. A plan began to form in her mind. If she could gather enough of that shed fur, perhaps she could craft some kind of insulating suit. It wouldn't be easy. Her fingers were already clumsy with cold, and she had no tools beyond what she could scavenge. But it was a chance, maybe her only one. She retreated from the cave slowly, careful not to disturb the creatures. Back outside, she searched for materials. There were broken bones scattered near the cliffs, remnants of creatures less lucky in the harsh environment. She selected a few sharp fragments and fashioned a crude needle. For thread, she stripped fibrous grasses growing stubbornly along the edges of frozen pools. The work was agonizing. Her fingers bled from the cold and the rough edges of the bones. The grasses snapped easily, forcing her to braid them together for strength. Time lost meaning. hours blended into one another under the eternal twilight of Glacis 6. Her body ached with exhaustion, but she pushed forward, driven by the sheer, stubborn will to live. Each trip to the Eurolon cave yielded handfuls of soft, insulating fur. She collected it carefully, ensuring she never startled the creatures. She spoke to them in soothing tones, though she doubted they understood her words. Over time, the Eurolons seemed to grow accustomed to her presence, no longer shifting uneasily when she entered. Back at her makeshift camp beneath the cliffs, she began assembling the suit. She layered the fur carefully, stitching it together with braided grass, reinforcing the seams with strips of tough hide salvaged from frozen carcasses. Piece by piece, the suit took shape, a patchwork of survival stitched together by desperation and ingenuity. The first night was the hardest. She had only completed a rough cloak and leggings, leaving much of her body still exposed. The cold was merciless. Sleep was impossible. She spent the night huddled beside a rock wall, shivering uncontrollably, whispering encouragements to herself to stay awake. Hypothermia clawed at her consciousness, but she fought it back, one ragged breath at a time. By the second night, the suit covered most of her body. The difference was profound. Trapped body heat created a pocket of warmth around her, reducing the deadly bite of the cold. For the first time since landing on Glacis 6, she believed she might actually survive. In the days that followed, Maya refined the suit, adding extra layers around joints and the chest where heat loss was greatest. She fashioned mittens and boots, lining them with multiple layers of fur. She even created a hood with a drawstring made from sinew, pulling it tight around her face to protect her skin. Each time she ventured out, she saw fewer and fewer of her classmates. Many had succeeded in entering hibernation, their bodies buried under snowdrifts, breathing so shallowly they appeared dead. Others were not so fortunate. She passed more than one abandoned pit or half-constructed shelter, silent monuments to the unforgiving nature of the exam. By the end of the 5th day, Maya stood atop a ridge, surveying the frozen expanse. She moved with a confidence born of survival. Her thermal suit, though crude, functioned better than she could have ever hoped. She was warm, she was mobile, she was alive, and for the first time she realized she was not merely enduring Glacis 6, she was conquering it. Far below, in the depths of a snowdrift, Professor Trithar observed her through the scope of his grav chair, making careful notes. His expression, hidden behind the frost-smeared visor of his suit, was one of growing fascination. This human, he thought, was rewriting the expectations of Deathworlders once again. Maya Torres, the lone human among a sea of alien cadets, was proving that survival was not a matter of biology, but of ingenuity, observation, and relentless determination. Maya stepped outside the cave just before the 12th cycle began. The air was quieter than usual, unnaturally still. Her boots sank deeper into the softened crust of snow beneath her feet, a subtle sign that something in the atmosphere was shifting. She tilted her head and listened. The wind, which had howled endlessly since the first day, had fallen into silence, as if the planet itself were holding its breath. Her instincts sharpened. This kind of stillness was not a relief, it was a warning. She secured her thermal hood, checked the seams of her suit, and pulled her grass-wrapped canister from her side pouch. Water was low again. She would need to collect more snow and melt it over the geothermal cracks she had discovered 2 ridges east of the cave. The Eurolons had avoided that area, likely due to the tremors and unstable ground, but it remained the only place where heat surged high enough to produce liquid water in less than an hour. The risk was worth it. She began her journey, retracing the uneven path marked by small symbols she had etched onto ice boulders with a stone shard. Every 50 meters, she paused to observe her surroundings, not because she felt uncertain, but because habit had trained her to absorb even the smallest signs of change. Flakes that fell differently, snow that sounded softer underfoot, or shifts in air pressure pressing against her chest. On Glacis 6, a world where predictability didn't exist, awareness was survival. When she arrived at the geothermal ridge, she crouched beside the exposed fissure, placing her gloved hand near the vent. The warmth seeped through the rock like an exhalation. She unpacked her ice-carved bowl, filled it with compacted snow, and placed it carefully at the edge of the vent. As the steam curled upward, she removed her gloves and began to rub her hands together, allowing the blood to return to her fingertips. The nerves screamed at first, but she gritted her teeth and kept moving. Circulation was life. A sound, distant but sharp, cracked across the landscape. She froze. It was not wind. It was the unmistakable report of splitting ice. Her eyes snapped to the east. A section of the ridge had begun to shift, the snow atop it slumping inward like a lung deflating. A moment later, the ledge collapsed, revealing a narrow cavern mouth beneath it. For a heartbeat, Maya stared at it, debating whether to approach or retreat. Curiosity won. She crept forward with deliberate steps, ensuring every footfall landed on stable ground. The crevice was narrow, almost too narrow for her to enter fully suited. She dropped to her knees and crawled through the opening, her palms brushing against icy stone. Inside, the air was denser, warmed faintly by geothermal veins that glowed orange and red like magma frozen mid-breath. At the far end of the tunnel, a shape moved. Maya tensed, her eyes adjusted quickly, and she identified the figure slumped against the glowing rock wall. A girl. An alien cadet curled in on herself, unmoving except for a slight twitch of her shoulders. Maya approached carefully, checking the girl's breathing. It was shallow but present. Her name came back to Maya in a flash. Sayla. From the moon of Osiris, a species known for temperature-sensitive skin and emotional memory recall. She had been one of the quieter students, always taking notes in silence, her gaze locked inward. Sayla's uniform was ripped along one sleeve, revealing bluish skin marbled with frostburn. Her water supply was empty, and her emergency beacon, useless under the exam's rules, hung loosely from her belt. Maya pressed a hand to the girl's forehead. It was cold, but not lifeless. Her metabolic rate must have failed to stabilize after the last temperature drop. Without intervention, she would not last another hour. Maya didn't hesitate. She wrapped Sayla in a section of the fur lining she had packed as a backup and secured her to Maya's side using straps from her own gear. The extra weight made crawling out of the tunnel nearly impossible, but Maya wedged her feet against the floor and pushed inch by inch until she reached open air again. Once outside, she stood, gasping. Then began the long march back to the cave. The trip took twice as long, with Sayli leaning heavily against her. Maya shifted her grip often, keeping the girl's head upright and supported, whispering words she couldn't hear just to keep herself sane. As the cave finally came into view, she nearly collapsed with relief. Inside, the Eurolon stirred gently at the sudden presence. One of the older ones rose from its resting position and ambled over, emitting a low, vibrating hum that warmed the air around it. Maya laid Sayla beside the creature, bundling her in insulating layers and positioning her next to the beast's flank. The hum grew stronger. The Eurolon understood. Maya slumped to the floor, her breath ragged. She had risked her warmth, her time, and her remaining energy for someone who might not recover. But the choice had been clear from the moment she saw the collapsed ridge. Leave Sayla to die, or try to do something better. Something human. As she rested, she noticed something she hadn't before. On the walls of the cave, faint claw marks etched in erratic patterns suggested the Eurolins had used this shelter for generations. Some markings were decorative, others directional. She followed one of the deeper grooves along the curve of the rock and found a second chamber behind a curtain of hanging fur. Inside were old remains, fossilized bones, broken shell fragments, and, more surprisingly, bundles of tightly coiled plant fibers woven into loops. She picked one up. It was a harness of sorts, clearly made by the creatures not simply found. For the first time, she realized that the Eurolons had a culture, primitive but intentional. They were not just surviving here, they were building, remembering, adapting. She returned to Sayla, who had begun to stir slightly, her fingers twitching beneath the layers. Maya placed a shard of warmed rock near her hands and pressed water to her lips. The girl swallowed instinctively. "You'll make it," Maya whispered, "but only if you don't give up." For the remainder of the cycle, Maya maintained a vigil. She repaired torn seams in her suit, checked the strength of her water container, and monitored Sayla's temperature by touch. Her body trembled constantly now, not from cold, but from depleted reserves. She hadn't eaten since the previous day. Even with the bulbs she had gathered, the nutrients were dwindling. She would have to forage again soon. But for now, she remained still, listening to the breath of the Eurolins and the faint murmurs from the recovering girl beside her. When the wind outside picked up again, returning with a howl that shook the ice above, Maya looked to the mouth of the cave and felt no fear. She had withstood worse. She had seen the worst the planet could offer and responded with something the examiners never expected: compassion paired with calculation. The others had buried themselves to hide from the cold. She had stepped into it and pulled others back. Her story wasn't about pain or isolation or even survival anymore. It was about transformation, not just of her body, but of her role in this place. She was no longer a stranger to Glacis 6. She was its student. And perhaps one of its protectors. The second to last cycle had ended, and she was still standing. The first tremor came while Maya was wrapping a new layer of moss around Sayla's legs. It was faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the occasional groan of shifting ice. But then the ground pulsed again, deeper, more deliberate. The fur bundles trembled, the cave's walls whispered under the stress, and a few flakes of frost fell from the ceiling. Maya paused, her fingers mid-knot. She turned her head slowly toward the main entrance. A second pulse traveled up her spine before the sound arrived. A low, subterranean growl, like the deep breathing of something ancient. She rose to her feet and moved toward the entrance, careful not to alarm the Eurolons. Outside, the air had changed once more. Not colder, heavier. She stepped into the snow and looked toward the western ridge, where dark clouds were piling unnaturally fast, not in the sky but at ground level, sweeping across the horizon like a wall of smoke. Her heart quickened. That wasn't weather. It was pressure, the kind that preceded an ice quake. She had read about them in the Academy's orientation modules. Glacis 6 had unstable tectonic chambers that occasionally released bursts of subterranean gas, fracturing the surface and swallowing entire valleys. Maya ran back into the cave. Sayla had managed to sit up, her skin still pale but her eyes more alert than before. Maya knelt beside her and grabbed her wrist. "We have to move," she said, urgency overtaking any sense of calm. "Now." Sayla nodded slowly, her voice too weak for words. Maya pulled the emergency sled closer, repacked a few essentials into her satchel, and secured Sayla into place. The Eurolons stirred, now visibly uneasy. One of the younger creatures stamped the ground, its claws clicking nervously. The herd was sensing it too. The tremors grew stronger, now regular enough to match a rhythm. A slow countdown. With a final look back at the shelter that had kept her alive for so long, Maya pulled the sled forward and began moving toward the narrow corridor that led to higher ground. The Eurolons began to follow. Not all of them, just 3. The matriarch hesitated, then let out a deep, harmonic bellow that reverberated against the ice. In response, the younger ones gathered around her, forming a protective cluster. Maya looked at them for only a moment before focusing ahead. She would not cry for creatures who made their own choices. The wind roared as the quake finally began in earnest. A sound like splitting glass filled the air as the earth cracked open somewhere behind her. She didn't look back. She ran. Her legs pumped through deepening snow, dragging the sled while shielding her eyes from airborne shards of ice. The terrain shifted beneath her feet as veins of heat escaped in bursts from the ground, warping the surface and creating sudden drops in ridges. Halfway up the ascent, the slope beneath her gave way. The left edge of the path collapsed into a new chasm. Maya fell, catching herself with her elbow before sliding further. The sled jerked violently as Sayla cried out in pain. Maya scrambled, dug her heels into the snow, and yanked the sled away from the edge with a desperate final pull. Her shoulders screamed in protest. Something inside it tore, but she didn't stop. By the time she reached the top, the cave was no longer visible. The entire valley below had shifted, covered in white mist and new fractures. She scanned the landscape. In the distance, she saw one of the observation pylons blinking faintly against the twilight. That meant the shuttle zone was less than 5 kilometers away. The quake had triggered the final phase of the exam. She was sure of it now. There would be no rest cycles, no further chance to wait. The planet was turning hostile in real time, and only the most mobile cadets would have any chance of making it to the end. Maya helped Sayla out of the sled and leaned her against a snowbank to rest. Then she pulled the last emergency bulb from her pouch and handed it over. "You drink this," she said firmly. "I don't care how it tastes." Sayla nodded and took it, her hands trembling. Maya's own stomach clenched with need, but she forced herself to look away. Hunger was irrelevant now. She walked several meters ahead, surveyed the upcoming terrain, and mapped a safe route using the protruding ridgelines. She could no longer afford guesswork. As they resumed the journey, Sayla walked slowly, leaning on Maya when needed. The going was brutal. Sections of the landscape had ruptured entirely, exposing vents of scalding steam and jagged ice blades that jutted out like spears. At one point, they had to cross a series of thin ridges over a deep canyon, balancing themselves against the wind and unstable footing. Sayla nearly fell twice, but Maya grabbed her both times, anchoring her with strength born of willpower alone. By the 4th kilometer, the blinking beacon was close enough to reflect in the snow. A shallow basin marked the extraction zone, but it was now covered in cracked terrain and swaying with heat distortion. No other cadets were visible. Either they had not made it, or they had chosen to wait below. Maya turned back and saw something she hadn't expected. 2 more cadets, one large and pale with triple-jointed arms, the other shorter with luminescent skin, were struggling up a nearby slope. She recognized the taller one as Darvax, who had mocked her during orientation week. He had once boasted that Deathworlders were glorified brutes. Now his gait was broken, his suit scorched and torn. The smaller cadet was limping badly. Maya hesitated for a moment, then jogged toward them. She helped the smaller cadet first, grabbing his arm and guiding him away from a falling sheet of ice. Darvax barely acknowledged her, his eyes unfocused, lips split from exposure. Sayla joined her, offering what support she could. Together, the 4 of them reached the basin just as a siren echoed through the wind, a deep, rising tone that signaled the imminent descent of the extraction vessel. Above, the clouds parted slightly, revealing the glowing silhouette of the shuttle cutting through the haze. It descended slowly, legs extending toward the cracked terrain. Maya shielded her face as the landing thrusters kicked up a storm of snow and heat. When the doors hissed open, a medical team poured out, guiding stretchers and scanning devices toward the cadets. Professor Trithar stood at the edge of the ramp, his blue skin dulled by frost and age. His eyes landed on Maya first. He nodded once, then turned to assess the others. A medic approached her and began scanning her vitals, but she waved him off. "I'm fine," she said. "Help them first." As she watched the others being carried into the shuttle, something loosened in her chest. Not relief, release. She had given all she could. She had chosen not to survive alone, and somehow that had become her strength. Once aboard, she sat silently on the floor of the rear cabin, her back against the bulkhead, staring out at the receding surface of Glacis 6. The cave was gone. The ridge had collapsed. The creatures she had lived beside would likely migrate to higher ground or not survive the change, but she would carry them with her. In her scars, in her memories, in her story. The shuttle broke through the upper atmosphere and into the cold silence of space. Maya closed her eyes and finally allowed herself to sleep, not because she was tired, but because she had nothing left to prove. The girl who had stepped onto Glacis 6 was no longer the one returning from it. When Maya woke, she was lying on a cushioned med platform inside the decontamination wing of the Academy vessel Vigilance, surrounded by the hum of distant engines and the soft beeping of medical scanners. Her first instinct was to sit up, but the dull ache in her arms and legs warned her not to rush. The warm air pressed against her face like a soothing hand, unfamiliar after the sharpness of Glacis 6. For a long moment she simply lay still, allowing her mind to catch up with her body. The room was bright and sterile, washed in muted silver and blue. A single observation panel displayed her biometric data, and next to it sat a folded version of her thermal suit, cleaned and neatly stacked. Across the chamber, a tall figure moved into view. Professor Trithar. He stood with hands clasped behind his back, his posture relaxed yet commanding. His eyes, pale and unreadable, settled on her with a gaze that felt less like judgment and more like study. "You're conscious," he said, his voice as deep and even as she remembered. Maya nodded slowly. Her throat was dry, but the pain had faded. "Yes," she replied. "How long?" 6 standard hours, he answered. "We crossed orbit 2 hours ago and docked at Celestia Base for recovery processing." She shifted upright, wincing as her spine adjusted to gravity again. "And the others?" "Stable," he said. Sayla regained full motor control during re-entry. Darvax remains under treatment for cold shock trauma. The smaller cadet, Kieran, will recover with no lasting damage. Maya absorbed the information in silence. Relief stirred in her chest, but it was quickly replaced by the familiar tension of uncertainty. The exam was over, but the consequences were not. She had survived the impossible, pulled others through it, and now she was back in a world where everything had rules again. She could already feel the weight of scrutiny tightening around her. Trither moved closer, his voice taking on a thoughtful tone. "You disobeyed protocol." She looked up, meeting his eyes. "Which one?" "You made contact with a dormant ecosystem," he said. "You modified materials not listed on the approved salvage list. You aided other cadets despite the solo survival clause." Maya's jaw tightened. "So I failed." "No," he said, and his tone shifted. "You passed." She blinked, unsure if she had heard correctly. "Barely," he added with a small tilt of his head, "but pass you did." He turned from her and walked toward the glass wall, where the silhouette of the base's outer corridors could be seen beyond frosted glass. "When we introduced this planet into the final exam phase, we intended to test adaptability. Most cadets treat these challenges as contests of endurance or aggression. You treated it as a conversation." Maya swung her legs over the side of the platform. "I didn't plan it that way, I just listened." Trithar nodded once. "And in doing so, you created a survival strategy more effective than any recorded in the last 6 cycles. Your thermal suit design is being reviewed by xenobiology labs. Your actions regarding the Uralons have drawn attention from the Department of Sentient Integration." She furrowed her brow. "Sentient integration?" "Yes," he said. "Initial analysis of the cave markings and object placement indicates cultural behavior. You may have discovered the first semi-sentient herd species on Glacis 6. Your report will form the foundation for a new classification protocol." Maya was silent for several seconds. The gravity of what he had said sat in her chest like a stone. She had spent so much time focused on keeping her breath steady, keeping her limbs warm, keeping Sayla alive, that she hadn't considered what her actions might mean beyond the ice. Trithar turned again, stepping closer. "The Academy will require your debrief, a full one, no omissions. You'll be assigned an evaluator for a closed tribunal, and your testimony will be cross-referenced with observation drone footage. There will be critics, those who believe you should have withdrawn when the quake began, or who think you intervened too often." Maya tilted her head. "But you don't—" He paused. Then, with a slight flicker in his translucent eyes, he said, "No. I think what you did was unexpected and necessary." With that, he turned and left the chamber without another word. Later that day, she was escorted to the Academy Tribunal chamber, an oval room built into the station's command deck, lined with panoramic screens and tiered seating. At the center sat the review panel, 3 officers, all high-ranking members of the Survivalist Division. They reviewed her report in silence as she stood before them, dressed now in the Academy's formal charcoal uniform. The footage played across the upper display. The moment she first stepped into the geothermal ridge, her hands gathering the shed fur, the construction of the suit, the dragging of the sled, the crossing of the ice canyon. Each action, recorded from the distant drones, was dissected by angles, timestamps, and notes. No commentary, just a silent retelling of a story she had lived inside of, beat by beat. One of the officers, a wiry man with a surgically enhanced voice modulator, finally spoke. "Cadet Torres, do you know how many regulations you bent during this operation?" Maya kept her shoulders square. "I wasn't counting." The second officer, an older woman with silver tattoos across her knuckles, raised her stylus. "Why did you continue moving west after sheltering 2 cadets? The extraction point would have reached you eventually." "I didn't want to gamble," Maya said. "The terrain was shifting. I knew if we stayed low, the next fracture could have buried us alive." The third officer, younger than the others, looked at her intently. "And the suit? You could have hoarded the fur. You could have stayed hidden until the pickup." Maya exhaled slowly. "That wasn't the kind of survival I came there to prove." The tribunal fell into silence for a moment. The first officer turned off the footage. The woman with silver tattoos leaned forward. "Your academic record was clean. Your psychological profile marked you as risk-averse. You had no history of leadership beyond simulation training. What changed?" Maya hesitated, then replied, "I stopped thinking like a visitor." She wasn't sure what kind of answer they wanted, but it was the only truth she had left. The tribunal released her later that cycle, pending formal classification. She had not been formally reprimanded, nor had she been praised. The Academy's tone, as always, remained neutral, but the glances in the corridors, the nods from fellow cadets, and the silent, respectful stares from instructors, those told her enough. When she returned to her quarters, her thermal suit had already been placed on display behind reinforced glass, labeled not by her name but by a catalog ID. Survival Design, Glacius 6, Composite Organic System A. She smiled slightly and touched the glass. The system didn't care about glory, but it had noticed her, and for now, that was enough. 2 weeks after her Tribunal appearance, Maya stood alone on the upper observation deck of Celestia Base, staring out into the black ocean of space beyond the reinforced dome. The stars hung motionless, scattered across the void like a map she had yet to read. Her reflection hovered faintly in the glass, quiet, older, no longer the cadet who had arrived months ago with fire in her chest and a hunger to prove herself. Something in her posture had changed. She still stood tall, still kept her shoulders back, but the tension that used to stiffen her jaw had gone, replaced by something quieter, something earned. She turned when she heard the soft whir of the lift behind her. Sayla stepped out slowly, her stride still slightly uneven but stronger than it had been. Her eyes had regained their shimmer, and the frost-burned scars along her neck were healing into a faint silver that caught the light. She approached Maya without speaking at first, her expression unreadable, until she finally stopped beside her and exhaled deeply. "You disappeared after the briefing," Sayla said. "I needed time," Maya replied. "I wasn't sure what to say to anyone." "You didn't need to say anything," Sayla said, her voice quieter now. "You already did more than enough." Maya gave a faint smile but didn't respond. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like a space for breathing, a rare kind of peace neither of them had experienced since before Glacis 6. "Do you know what happens next?" Sayla asked after a while. "Yes," Maya said. "Trither briefed me this morning. The Department of Sentient Integration wants a full behavioral study on the Eurolons. I've been asked to return." Sayla turned sharply. "Return? You're going back down there?" Maya nodded slowly. "Not for survival training, for documentation, observation. The research team wants someone with first-hand experience. Someone the creatures might not fear." "Do you want that?" Sayla asked. "After everything?" "I didn't at first," Maya admitted. "But now I do. I wasn't ready to say goodbye to that place. I left too quickly. I want to see it again, without frostbite crawling through my skin, without counting calories and calculating collapse. I want to walk among those creatures and understand why they didn't run from me." Sayla looked down at her own hands, now wrapped in thin synth bandage strips that shimmered like snow. "I dream about the wind sometimes," she said. "It's always just outside the door, but it never comes in." Maya said nothing. Some things weren't meant to be answered. Later that cycle, she packed her things into a travel satchel, simpler than the standard Academy pack. No survival gear this time, just environmental clothing, sensor tags, a multi-tool, and a compact recording system. The return expedition to Glacis 6 would include 6 researchers, 2 engineers, and 1 cadet. Herself. She wasn't going as a student now. Her role was Embedded Adaptive Specialist, a title she hadn't asked for but didn't resent. It was honest. She had adapted. More than that, she had changed. When the research shuttle touched down on Glacis 6 once more, the sky was almost clear. A faint light shimmered across the atmosphere, refracting from the distant binary sun system that hadn't been visible during her last descent. The planet's silence was just as profound, but now it felt like a greeting, not a warning. She stepped onto the ice first, anchoring her boots into the now familiar crust. The air was still bitter, but she wore the newly upgraded version of her original suit, stitched not by hand this time, but replicated by Academy engineers using her pattern. They had dubbed it Torres-class adaptive gear. She found the name awkward, but let it be. The team followed behind her, each carefully stepping where she did. She led them to the same ridgeline, now partially buried beneath new snowfall. The cave was gone, collapsed during the final quake, but the trail leading eastward had shifted again. Her eyes scanned the horizon, searching for movement. Nothing yet. But she could feel it, a presence beneath the ice. An hour passed. Then 2. Still no sign of the herd. The researchers grew restless, exchanging murmurs, adjusting instruments. Maya ignored them. She crouched by the snow, removed one glove, and pressed her hand flat against the surface. The cold seeped into her bones, but she focused on stillness, on memory, on the rhythm of breath and silence. Then, at the edge of her hearing, came the familiar hum. She stood slowly, turned toward the sound, and watched as a shape moved along the far ridge. Large, slow, unmistakable. The Eurolon matriarch emerged from the whiteness, her thick fur glistening with frost. Behind her came 2 more, then 4, then a dozen. They moved with the same steady grace, unbothered by the wind, untouched by the tremors that had reshaped the planet's skin. The researchers froze, unsure whether to approach. Maya lifted a hand and stepped forward alone. The matriarch halted, tilted her head slightly, and let out a deep, harmonic note. Lower than the wind, but stronger than memory. Maya dropped to one knee and opened her satchel. From within, she drew a bundle of moss she had requested from the lab, cultivated from spores recovered on her gear. She laid it in the snow between them, an offering, or perhaps a message. The Eurolon watched her, then slowly moved closer. Not fast, not afraid, just certain. When the matriarch reached the moss, she lowered her head and inhaled, then turned her gaze to Maya again. It wasn't understanding exactly, it was recognition. Maya reached forward and gently brushed her fingers across the edge of the creature's fur. The warmth was still there. The heart beat, steady and ancient, pulsed beneath layers of time and adaptation. This was the proof the research division needed. But for Maya, the real proof had nothing to do with classification. The creature hadn't forgotten her. In the days that followed, the team established a monitoring post along the edge of the valley. Maya moved freely among the herd, documenting their behavior, interpreting patterns, and occasionally sleeping beside them during observation cycles. The others watched from a distance, recording everything, but it was Maya the Eurolans followed. She no longer wore her full suit. In the final days of the expedition, she crafted a new cloak from harvested moss and recycled fibers, stitched in the same style as the original and draped over her back like a second skin. When the mission ended and the shuttle returned to retrieve the team, she stood at the edge of the ridge and looked down at the creatures one last time. The matriarch met her gaze from below, unmoving. Maya lifted her hand in farewell. Back at Celestia Base, she declined reassignment to the main Academy Corps. She accepted instead a permanent post with the Sentient Integration Initiative, where she would train new recruits, not just in survival, but in listening, in empathy, in recognition. Years later, her story would become part of the curriculum. Cadets would study the Torres Protocol in adaptation modules. Her original suit would remain on display in the Academy's atrium, not as a trophy, but as a symbol, not of endurance, but of choice. The girl who once battled cold and silence had not been broken by either. She had shaped them into allies. She had stepped onto a world that offered no welcome and gave it one. And in doing so, she changed everything.